60 years ago to the day, November 20th, the world sighed in relief as the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. It was the closest we ever came to nuclear Armageddon till now, with Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons in the war. And then there's the dire and deteriorating condition of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia, in Russian-occupied Ukraine. The situation is carefully monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, the UN's nuclear watchdog, tasked with making sure nuclear facilities are safe and atomic material is used only for peaceful purposes. Its Director General, Rafael Mariano Grossi, recently inspected the site, which may be the most dangerous place in the world. So correct me if I'm wrong. Is this the first time a major power plant has been under fire in the middle of a war?
Well, it's an unprecedented thing, really, in so many ways. This place is at the front line, which makes the whole thing so volatile and in need of an urgent action.
Zaporizhzhia has been shelled repeatedly since March, with both sides blaming each other. Before the war, the plant supplied 20% of Ukraine's power. It's now largely idle, but the reactors still need to be constantly cooled down with circulating water. If they overheat, it could lead to nuclear catastrophe within hours. The whole system is being cooled by electricity that's coming in from the town, and there's shelling. So what would happen if that electricity went down?
What you have in that situation is emergency systems that kick in, like diesel generators that you can have in a private property, and you don't want the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, and one of the biggest in the world, to be cooled with basically an emergency system which is dependent on fuel, because when your diesels are out of whatever you put in it to make them work, then what happens? Then you have a meltdown, then you have a big radiological nuclear emergency or an accident, and this is what we are trying to prevent.
So this situation is totally precarious.
Totally. Until we have this plant protected, the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe is there.
Possibly dwarfing Chernobyl, a far smaller Ukrainian plant that famously blew up 36 years ago.
We are moving ahead.
In late August, after months of negotiating with both sides, Director General Grossi led his agency's first mission into an active war zone to inspect the stability of the site.
And as we were approaching the last Ukrainian checkpoint, we started hearing shooting.
Speed up.
Quite heavy shooting, very close to us.
Speed up, everyone, speed up, move through.
So at that point, even the people on the checkpoint were running for shelter.
Do you think that the convoy itself was a target?
I think it was a clear attempt to stop us, to say, go home. This is not your place.
But they proceeded. There were soldiers, tanks, and armored trucks everywhere. The Russians are actually using the nuclear plant as their military base. When you went to visit to inspect, you could go anywhere?
Yes.
You weren't kept from...
Yes, we are the IAEA. We are known as the nuclear watchdog.
Well, there are reports that you weren't allowed into some crisis room, into the control room. Is that not true?
Well, there were areas where we were limited, but all the things we needed to see, we could see.
You didn't want to see the control room?
Yeah, we did want to see it, but for us, what is important is to be looking at the essential nuclear operation of the plant, and this we could see.
That included evidence that rockets had come dangerously close to the reactors and other sensitive areas.
I was on the top of a building where they are storing fresh fuel, the fuel that is going to go into the reactors. And
nuclear fuel is what we're talking about.
Nuclear fuel. And I could see very big holes on that
on the roof?
Yeah, at least two I saw, very, very big.
On a satellite photo, he also pointed out the switchyard where the electricity comes in from the town.
So this is where the external power comes to cool the reactors down. And this place was shelled several times, which tells you that people knew exactly what they were doing.
They were trying to cut off the power source.
Exactly.
Shelling also destroyed one of the plant's office buildings. These pictures were given to us by Andrei Tuz, a plant spokesman who fled Ukraine after working 4 months under Russian occupation. So tell us what that was like, working inside that plant under Russian occupation.
Yes, Russian troops take all our top manager with gun, and they do only what Russian troops want.
Did you feel like a hostage?
Yes. I feel like I am prisoner in this nuclear power plant. I cannot say nothing because they go with gun.
There have been reports of imprisonments, kidnappings, and torture of Ukrainian employees. The head of the plant was detained. Andrei Tuz told us about the pressure one of the safety inspectors felt.
It's his work to go and check some pumps, how it works, how parameter, what pressure, what temperature. But he go and Russian tanks stay in front of him. It's terrible. He cannot do his work. It's to protect nuclear fuel, to control nuclear reaction.
When you're operating at a nuclear power plant and you're under stress and you're worried and you're feeling threatened, doesn't that lead to the possibility of human error?
Of course. Yes.
And the shelling goes on.
And the shelling goes on. And this is why we have been trying. I have been pushing for the establishment of a protection zone, which is basically don't attack the plant.
Mr. President,
Good to see you.
He took his proposal to both President Zelensky in Kyiv and President Putin in a one-on-one meeting last month in St. Petersburg. Interestingly, you sat very close to him. Actually, I think closer than you and I are right now.
Maybe yes.
Would you say that he is familiar with what's going on
Absolutely.
at this nuclear plant?
He knows every detail of it, which was surprising to me. In my conversation with him, I could see that he had a very detailed knowledge, not only of the layout of the plant, but also, and very importantly, of the electrical access, the external power source. So
Where these things are being bombed.
it is a facility that he knows very well.
Is Mr. Putin trying to use this plant as a weapon? And we know that he's weaponized energy in this war because of the way he's used oil and gas. It just raises the question whether this plant is seen in his mind as a way to squeeze the Ukrainians. Someone said to us the other day, this is his dirty bomb, this plant.
Yeah, but if you protect it, there's no dirty bomb.
On Monday, the day we met Grossi, Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met in Bali and condemned Putin's threat to use a nuclear weapon. And in Turkey, CIA Director William Burns warned his Russian counterpart of the consequences of such a move. Here we are, talking about the possibility of a dirty bomb or a real bomb. I mean, this kind of idea of nuclear Armageddon, because countries are now throwing the idea of using a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
They're just throwing it up in the air.
When you talk about using nuclear weapons, as you could use this mortar or that howitzer or that, this is a completely different ballgame.
So heads of state should not be throwing this around.
They should not be doing that.
Rafael Grossi, at 61, has been working to prevent the proliferation of nukes for almost 4 decades. He's seen here with his fellow Argentinian, Pope Francis, and his children, 7 daughters and 1 son.
Come on, guys.
We watched him coaching his son's soccer team on a rare day off. He's been particularly busy, given the number of rogue states suspected of developing a bomb. How close is Iran to making a nuclear bomb?
At the current level of production of this enriched uranium, Iran has accumulated already enough material to have more than one device if they chose to do that. But we don't have any information that would indicate that Iran has a nuclear weapon program at the moment.
Really?
Really?
So if I said to you, have we reached the point of no return with Iran? Is it time to just admit they're a nuclear power?
No, we haven't reached that point, but we need to work very hard so we don't get there.
Director General Grossi's concerned about another country that has become a member of the nuclear club, North Korea, which is expected to conduct its first underground nuclear test since 2017. And that's not the only issue on his plate in the Pacific. The Chinese are protesting the sale of 8 nuclear submarines by the United States and Great Britain to Australia.
Yes.
The subs contain nuclear war material. Do you protest this sale?
If they want to do this, they have to have a special arrangement with us.
And does Australia have a special arrangement with you?
We have started working on that, which means that we should be able to come to an agreement that would allow us to inspect this nuclear material in an appropriate way so that it is not diverted, used to make bombs.
Do you think this agreement, if it should come to pass, would satisfy the Chinese? Have you talked to China and
But
said...
China has a very firm position against this.
Yes.
They have been very critical of it. They have even been very critical of me.
There's this issue of a double standard. You know, if the sale was to Libya, the West would be screaming. And that it's Australia, well, you know, they get a pass. Double standard question.
They may get their pass. They will not get mine until I have a satisfactory agreement.
I want to go back to the nuclear power plant for 1 second, into Zaporizhia. When I realized that a nuclear power plant was under attack, my mind
It's
can't
mind-boggling.
even calibrate
Yeah,
what this means.
exactly. The demand for protection of the plant is very important. You don't shell a nuclear power plant. You don't storm a nuclear power plant.
What about using a nuclear power plant as a military base?
This is part of the agreement I have proposed.
Yeah, but no one's agreeing.
They will,
You think?
I think.
You're always optimistic. This is you.
I must. Should I throw the towel? If I do that? Can you imagine that? No.
North Korea continues to test missile after missile, raising tensions with the United States. Kim Jong-un has promised to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. Such a weapon could eventually carry a nuclear warhead and threaten American cities. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis called that possibility and the missiles Kim has aimed at South Korea, quote, a clear and present danger to the world. As we first reported in February, we went to South Korea and saw how tense the situation has become. We got 2 important perspectives from the commander of the 28,000 American troops there and the highest-ranking North Korean to defect in decades. He told us Kim's missile program is part of an obsession with the survival of his regime.
I've been in Seoul for 6 months. And to be honest, I was never, public until now.
We went for an evening out in Seoul with Tae Young-ho. He was North Korea's deputy ambassador in London before he defected in August.
So first time on the subway.
Yes, that's right.
A defection by someone of his rank is extremely rare.
Where do we stand?
This was the first time he had walked about in public. Just off camera, 6 bodyguards watched his every move as we made our way down one of the busiest shopping streets in Asia. North Korea has assassinated defectors in Seoul.
In order to prevent more possible defections from North Korea, I think Kim Jong-un may do anything.
Even kill you.
Of course, why not?
The man who could order an assassination is Kim Jong-un. The dictator is the third member of the Kim family to rule North Korea. They have controlled the impoverished country with an ironclad fist for 70 years. This missile test was in February. Kim devotes a quarter of his country's economy to weapons like this and his million-man army, despite widespread food shortages.
Kim Jong-un strongly believes that once he possesses ICBM, then he can easily scare off America.
Right now, how dangerous is North Korea to the stability of South Korea and as a threat to the United States?
Kim Jong-un's capability to wreak harm, not only to America, but also South Korea and the world, should not be underestimated.
During his 5 years in power, Kim Jong-un has expanded North Korea's nuclear arsenal, despite international sanctions that have brought his country's economy to its knees. Electricity is scarce. From space, North Korea is a black hole. That's it, wedged between the shining lights of South Korea and China to the north. Tae said he was living a comfortable life here at the North Korean embassy in London before he fled with his wife and 2 grown sons.
The safety is guaranteed by the government.
His job in London was to spread North Korean propaganda and report back on his colleagues.
You all live together under one roof.
Yes.
So you could keep an eye on each other?
Keep an eye on each other, control each other, and even spy on each other.
But Tae said he lost all faith in the regime when Kim Jong-un killed his own uncle in 2013 and executed dozens of perceived enemies, including diplomats.
I've seen tape of you giving speeches.
Yes.
In London. You're very convincing. You seem to be a true believer yourself.
If I show any sign of hesitation, then I would be,
What would happen to you?
I would be sent to prison camps. So my whole family's life will be jeopardized.
Tae said there was one big obstacle to his defection.
All North Korean diplomats are forced to leave one of their children back in Pyongyang as a hostage. See?
As a hostage?
Yes. When my children grow up.
His break came when that policy unexpectedly changed, and Tae's oldest son was allowed to join the family in London. They all agreed to defect. He would not give us the details of his escape and who helped, but we know he was kept in a safe house by South Korean intelligence agents and questioned for more than 3 months. He said it was too dangerous for us to meet his family.
Now, I've been talking to you for a couple of days now. You come from a secretive place.
Yes.
But I think you still have lots of secrets.
Sure, yes.
How do we know that what he is telling us is the truth and not just self-serving?
You know, when a defector makes a decision to jump ship, he is doing it at a huge cost. His co-workers, relatives, in-laws will be purged or killed.
Chung Min Lee was South Korea's ambassador for national security until last year. He said looks here can be deceiving. The risk of war today is exceptionally high.
I think most Americans right now would see this as a holdover from the Cold War. But it seems to be quite hot when you're here.
This is the only place on the entire planet where you have nearly 1 million forces on both sides standing ready to fight a war in basically a nanosecond. And who is there right in the middle of this? It's basically the U.S. forces.
If there is war, this is where the big fight will take place.
Lee helped shape Seoul's policy toward North Korea. He went with us to Panmunjom, the village in the 2.5-mile wide demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea. As we got closer, Seoul's sprawl gave way to military checkpoints. The agreement that suspended the Korean War was signed here, but there's still no peace treaty. The war began when the Communist North invaded in 1950. 34,000 Americans were killed in what amounted to a stalemate.
So this is the longest war on paper since World War II. So we are still technically in a state of war.
Today, both sides still stare each other down. That's North Korea right there, that building just 100 yards away. We were told to avoid sudden movements that could be interpreted as threatening. It wasn't long before North Korean soldiers took an interest in all the activity. So we went inside a negotiation hut that straddles the border.
What is right behind
Right behind the door is basically from there on, since this is North Korea, once you go out, that's it. We have no jurisdiction on that side of the door.
So if I were to walk out that door,
That's it.
I'm in the hands of North Korea.
That's true.
Let's stay on this side.
Let's stay on this side.
It was all surreal. This part of the DMZ closest to Seoul had the feel of a Cold War theme park, complete with a fake village on the North Korean side built to impress the South. And in case you missed the point, loudspeakers blared propaganda. Martial songs praising Kim Jong-un. A few miles away, tourists crowded an observation deck, snapping photos with troops, cardboard cutouts, and the real ones. What the visitors could not see on the other side of those mountains are 10,000 artillery pieces the North Korean military has aimed at Seoul, all of which could reach the 28 million people in and around the South Korean capital. U.S. war planners estimate 500,000 people could be killed in a second Korean War.
Is there any other metropolitan area on Earth this vulnerable?
Certainly nothing that approaches Seoul in terms of the size, the density of the population. There's nothing like it.
U.S. Air Force General James Slife flew with us over the city. It's just 30 miles from the DMZ. We landed at Osan Air Base, where Korean airmen and their American colleagues monitor all activity north of the DMZ. For security, they shut off the giant video displays right before we came in. This facility is among the first to detect North Korean missile launches.
You're like on a war footing all the time here.
That's right. This is truly one of those places where the best way to prevent a war is being ready for a war.
The North's latest missile tests used a new type of solid fuel engine and were fired from mobile launchers, making them quick to deploy and difficult for U.S. satellites to detect in real time.
With the development of ballistic missiles, with the development of nuclear weapons, things here have a tension that you can feel in the air as you move around places like this.
We wanted to talk to the general who leads U.S. forces in Korea and would command Korean troops in the event of a war. He asked to meet us at Guard Post 4. It's a citadel on critical high ground at the end of a road lined with landmines. We were the first American news crew allowed in.
Hands up.
This was no Cold War theme park. Body armor was required, and artillery was on standby in the event we came under fire.
Hello, General.
Nice
How are
to see
you?
you.
Very nice to meet you.
All right.
General Vincent Brooks has commanded U.S. forces fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I don't think people at home know how tense this line is.
What it takes to go from the condition we're in at this moment to hostilities again is literally the matter of a decision on North Korea's side to say fire. And on top of this, we have the missile capability that's been developed. Over 120 missiles fired just in the time of Kim Jong-un alone.
So now they're talking about ICBMs that might be able to reach the west coast of the United States. How do you stop them from taking that next step?
North Korea is responsible for the direction that the region is going. It is responsible for the conditions of instability that are starting to arise. It has to take responsibility for that and stop.
His country is poor, his people are starving. What is it that he wants?
Survival and recognition.
Survival. Kim Jong-un is now recognized as a global threat. U.S. intelligence estimates he has at least 10 nuclear weapons. If the U.S. decided it had no choice but to launch a preemptive strike on an ICBM test site, it could trigger the unthinkable.
If North Korea uses nuclear weapons, it will be met with an effective and overwhelming response. And they can take it to the bank. We make that same point to our allies and partners like the Republic of Korea, like Japan.
Effective and overwhelming response.
Effective and overwhelming response.
Wipe North Korea off the map.
Whatever overwhelms you.
That warning rang in our ears as we returned to Seoul and met one last time with defector Tae Young-ho. We asked about his brother and sister still in North Korea.
What do you think has happened to them?
They will be sent to prison camps. That is what I'm absolutely sure.
Does that weigh on you?
Of course, yes. I cannot get rid of that kind of nightmare every night of seeing my brother and sister in prison camps.
Tae told us he believes he can help topple the North Korean regime by encouraging other defections and speaking out. During the campaign, President Trump called Kim Jong-un a maniac. His language has been much more careful since the latest missile tests.
One of the key questions of this presidential campaign is who has the health and temperament to become the next commander-in-chief and assume the unthinkable power to use nuclear weapons. The Cold War as we knew it may be over, but both the U.S. and Russia still keep enough nuclear weapons on alert to end civilization. And now a new Cold War is brewing, with both sides developing more sophisticated and more accurate weapons. Tonight, we're going to show you what this new Cold War looks like from inside the U.S. Strategic Command. STRATCOM, as it's called, trains every day for the possibility of nuclear war and takes extraordinary measures to make sure one person and one person only, the President of the United States, can give the order to launch a nuclear weapon.
130, 120, 110, 1 repeat, 84.
The USS Kentucky rising to the surface off the coast of Hawaii. Nearly 2 football fields long, it is the deadliest engine of destruction in the American arsenal. Able to carry almost 200 nuclear warheads atop the missiles loaded beneath those hatches. Commander Brian Freck is the captain.
The warheads that can be carried on my missiles are extremely powerful.
And compare them to the bomb that leveled Hiroshima.
Much more powerful than that. Much more powerful than Hiroshima.
Up to 30 times more powerful. And on any given day, a number of these submarines are hiding somewhere in the world's oceans, ready to respond to a launch order from the president.
When you're out here, are other countries looking for you?
I always operate on that assumption that someone is looking for me.
Has anybody ever found you?
No. Not even close.
You sure?
Yes, I am.
60 Minutes found the Kentucky, but only because we had arranged a rendezvous to go aboard.
If this boat were a country, you'd be a nuclear power.
That's true, yes, sir.
Does that ever give you pause to have all that power under your command?
It's a lot of responsibility, but with that responsibility comes a lot of training and practice.
Die. Oven cycled, oven shut.
Operating at a depth of 160 feet, the Kentucky's crew practiced the procedures needed to launch its missiles.
Set condition 1SQ for training. This is the captain. This is an exercise.
Set condition 1SQ for training, Count Weapons Act. Spin up all missiles. Chief of the Watch, sound the general alarm.
Sound the general alarm, right, sir.
I I have permission to fire. Con weapons act.
Before that trigger can be squeezed, multiple keys, including one that unlocks the missile tubes, which take up approximately 1/3 of the ship, have to be brought out from different safes.
No one person can make a launch happen. So I have keys in my possession. Other members of the crew have keys in their possession.
One key is carried to the captain by 2 sailors, who both must hold it.
Captain, launch is authorized.
And here's the thing you need to know about the safe where that key is kept.
No one on board has the combination. We get that combination with the launch order. That is my way of knowing that the president has ordered the launch, is when the combination he gives me opens that safe.
The president literally gives you the combination to the safe that the key is in.
Yes. You have permission to fire.
2 weapons, you have permission to fire, aye, sir. Weapons, Con, you have permission to fire.
The Kentucky and other nuclear missile submarines, along with intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear bombers,
Attention on deck.
are under the command of Admiral Cecil Haney,
Your nuclear forces are capable of executing all assigned missions.
head of the U.S. Strategic Command. Haney is the most powerful military officer you've never heard of, in command not just of the nation's nuclear forces, but its space satellites and cyber weapons as well.
There are no significant solar activity causing impacts to satellite operations or communications.
His morning briefing at Strategic Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska is classified above top secret.
Thank you. Appreciate the update.
That clock-marked POTUS, short for President of the United States, tells Haney what time zone President Obama is in case he has to reach the commander-in-chief in a hurry.
So who in the United States government has the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons?
Only the President of the United States has that authority.
Does Congress have to approve?
No, Congress does not have to approve.
So these really are the President's own weapons?
It's our nation's weapons with the President's authority, yes.
Attention on deck.
Haney took us to his Global Operations Center, a top-secret facility 3 stories underground. If a missile were launched against the United States, the warning would be received here, and that clock would start ticking down. Colonel Barbara Buells was the watch commander.
I see this sign up here, red impact,
Yes,
blue
sir.
impact time. So red impact would be an enemy missile,
That is correct.
and you would have a time.
We would have a time to impact. And blue impact would be any U.S. counterattack.
Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Geelan would pull out the options for a retaliatory nuclear strike.
My responsibility as the STRATCOM Nuclear Strike Advisor is to be the expert on Nuclear Decision Handbook and the alert status of all U.S. nuclear forces.
The Nuclear Decision Handbook.
Yeah, also known as the Black Book.
Black Book. So is there a copy of the Black Book down here?
There is. It's in the safe down here, sir.
An identical copy of the Black Book is in that briefcase which follows the president wherever he goes.
So he's never away from the options.
That's correct.
And would they tell him what kinds of weapons you would use, what targets you would hit?
They would be that specific, yes.
Would they give him an estimate of casualties?
Yeah. We would have to give the president answers to a lot of different questions. That's one that I would expect to get.
Admiral Haney would go to a room called the battle deck where he would talk directly to the president.
And is this the phone you would use?
This is one of the phones I might use, yes.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense. I don't see the man who
You're
controls...
looking for the president.
I am.
I can speak to the president directly from this microphone.
And in a crisis, how long does it take to get the president on the line?
Not very long.
If Russia launched a missile from a submarine off the coast of the United States, it would take only minutes to reach its target.
So how long, in fact, does the president have to make a decision?
He has minutes, 7, 8, 9 minutes, depending on details, but less than 10 minutes.
Former Secretary of Defense William Perry was a key architect of nuclear weapons during the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
If the weapons can be launched within minutes, does that mean we're still in the same old hair trigger standoff that we were during the Cold War?
That's right. We are, and we still have launch on warning, the same policy we had then. We still have the same hair trigger response.
So what's changed since the Cold War if we're still on this hair trigger alert?
Fundamentally, nothing has changed.
But the numbers of weapons are much lower now than during the Cold War.
The number of weapons are sufficient to destroy, obliterate all of civilization.
Still?
Still. It doesn't take that many. We still have more than 1,000 nuclear weapons on alert, ready to go. It doesn't take 1,000 to destroy civilization.
At the end of the Cold War, both sides pledged to point their missiles at the open ocean. But it would take just minutes to change back to real targets. That provides a small hedge against an accidental war triggered by a false alarm of the kind Perry experienced in 1979 when a watch officer mistakenly inserted a training tape into a computer.
So it looked like 200 ICBMs were on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. Happily, we got that situation figured out before we had to go to the president. But had we not, he would have received a call at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Sir, you have 7 or 8 minutes to decide whether to launch this before these missiles land on our ICBM silos."
And what was the fail-safe there? What stopped it from going to the president?
What stopped it was an astute general who sensed something was wrong.
If you've had one serious case in 45 years, that would seem like a pretty good record.
Yeah, it only takes one. It only takes one.
Strategic Command is building a new $1.2 billion headquarters, but it won't be any more able to survive a nuclear blast than the underground command center in the current headquarters. That clock counting down the time to missile impact would also tell Admiral Haney how long he had to get out of there alive.
Safe escape time that you see indicated is the time left remaining for Admiral Haney, as the commander of US STRATCOM, to exit the battle deck, to be able to make it to his commander support aircraft, to be able to board that aircraft and continue to provide his advice to the President of the United States as his senior nuclear advisor.
On the tarmac at STRATCOM, air crews drill to take off from this airborne command post fast enough to escape incoming nuclear weapons. If Admiral Haney's headquarters were destroyed and he didn't make it out in time,
the President is talking to his...
It would be up to Rear Admiral Andy Lennon to assume command and make sure the President and only the President could still give the order to launch nuclear weapons.
We're in voice communications with the President.
Talking to the President personally?
Yes, sir. So that way we are ensuring that we're getting the President's intent.
How do you know it's the President?
We have some very complex and secure procedures to authenticate the President and to be sure that we're really talking to the President of the United States.
So he can't just tell you, this is the President speaking?
He can, but we will authenticate to verify that it is the President speaking.
Once the President has given you that order, what do?
Then we would communicate that order to our strategic forces, our intercontinental ballistic missiles, our bombers, or our submarines.
Keep alive, sound the general alarm.
Sound the general alarm, aye, sir.
The order would be received on board the Kentucky and the crew would go through launch procedures they have practiced hundreds of times before. Last year, the Kentucky actually fired an unarmed missile in a test flight which lit up the California sky and caused a brief UFO scare. Had it carried a real warhead.
This is our meteorological effects officer.
Stuart Miller, a young Air Force captain aboard the airborne command post, would begin charting the unthinkable.
My main role is gathering information on nuclear detonations worldwide and then applying meteorological data to them, specifically winds, to figure out if there's fallout, depending on the attributes of the detonation, where the fallout's going, how many people might be affected, who might be affected, things of that nature.
So you basically come up with a casualty estimate of?
Essentially, yes. That's one of the things that I can provide.
You must have looked at some pretty depressing scenarios.
We kind of do, yeah. Yes.
Have you ever had the conversation with yourself, well, what if the President issued an order to use nuclear weapons and I didn't agree with it? Would I carry out that order?
The President expects me as his combatant commander to provide him the best military advice I have. So he would expect me to voice my opinion.
You would have a voice, but if you disagreed with the decision?
I'm a military man, And we follow the orders of our commander-in-chief.
So what are the chances the next president would actually have to make the fateful decision whether to use nuclear weapons? It's greater than you might think. That part of the story next Sunday on 60 Minutes. President Obama's nuclear strategy states that while the threat of all-out nuclear war is remote, the risk of a nuclear attack somewhere in the world has actually increased. When that was written 3 years ago, the risk came from a rogue nation like North Korea. Back then, the US and Russia were said to be partners. But that was before Russia invaded Crimea, using military force to change the borders of Europe, and before its president, Vladimir Putin, and his generals began talking about nuclear weapons. For generations, nuclear weapons have been seen as a last resort to be used only in extreme circumstances. But in this new Cold War, the use of a nuclear weapon is not as unlikely to occur as you might think. Air-launched cruise missiles being loaded onto a long-range B-52 bomber at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
When you see it close up, it's even bigger than you think it is.
It is an impressive machine, about 185,000 pounds empty, but it's built to carry weapons and gas.
Major General Richard Clark commands all of this country's nuclear bombers. And these are the weapons?
Yes, sir. These are air-launched cruise missiles. It is the primary nuclear weapon for the B-52.
Clark told us these are training missiles, so they're not armed with nuclear warheads. The B-52 can carry 20 cruise missiles, 6 under each wing and 8 in the bomb bay.
So this is the rotary launcher, and it holds 8 air-launched cruise missiles within the internal bomb bay of the B-52. It's a tight fit, but the way it works is the launcher rotates, allows the weapon to release and send it on its way.
So it's like the chamber of a revolver.
Same idea, just much bigger bullets.
As the most visible arm of the American nuclear arsenal, these bombers are meant to send a message to an international audience.
We can put this aircraft anywhere we want, anytime we want, and both our allies and our adversaries take note.
This is basically a nuclear show and tell.
It's not just a show and tell, because it will deliver.
Within the last 2 years, B-52s have begun sending that message directly to Russia, flying missions not seen since the Cold War. It started after Vladimir Putin changed history by invading an independent country, Ukraine, and seizing its republic of Crimea.
The fact that military force would be used to change an internationally recognized border in the central part of Europe, that was new.
Now retired, General Philip Breedlove was the supreme Allied commander in Europe when Russia took over Crimea. The invasion was carried out by so-called little green men, Russian soldiers wearing uniforms without insignia. But looming in the background were nuclear weapons. Was there ever any indication that Vladimir Putin was prepared to use his nuclear weapons in any way?
Vladimir Putin said himself that he considered raising the alert status of his nuclear force.
He had considered it?
He said it himself.
Putin said he had given an order to his military to be prepared to increase the readiness of his nuclear forces if the U.S. and NATO tried to block his takeover of Crimea. We were not looking for a fight, Putin said in this interview, but we were ready for the worst-case scenario.
They see nuclear weapons as a normal extension of a conventional conflict.
So to them, nuclear war is not unthinkable?
I think to them the use of nuclear weapons is not unthinkable.
It says so in their military doctrine signed by Putin in 2014. Russia shall reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. Putin has personally directed nuclear exercises which have increased in both size and frequency, according to Breedlove. More threatening?
Certainly they get your attention.
More aggressive?
Clearly.
And the U.S. responded with more aggressive exercises of its own. 1 year after Crimea, 4 B-52s flew up over the North Pole and North Sea on an exercise called Polar Growl. The B-52s were unarmed, but that little fin on the side of the fuselage identified them as capable of carrying nuclear weapons.
What I plotted here are the two routes for these planes.
Hans Christensen, director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, used Google Earth to show us the message that sent Russia.
But each bomber can carry 20 cruise missiles, a maximum of them. So we're talking about potentially 80 cruise missiles that could have been launched against targets inside Russia at this particular time.
Using the cruise missile's range of 1,500 miles, Christensen plotted his own hypothetical lines showing how far they could potentially reach into Russia.
And the endpoints of those red lines?
Yes. Each of them go to a facility in Russia that could be a potential target for nuclear weapons.
The Russians would look at that and see it as a dry run for an attack on targets inside Russia.
I guess they can draw the conclusions that they need to draw.
80 cruise missiles in your face.
It's a lot of firepower.
Was that the message?
That's a message, for sure.
The last time American nuclear bombers flew a mission like that was during the Cold War.
This was a significant exercise for us. We're training the way we might have to fight.
It was an unmistakable warning, but Rear Admiral Steve Perot says there's no indication the Russian military has changed its thinking about nuclear weapons.
Disturbingly, in recent years, there have been specific doctrinal and public statements made by other Russian leaders that indicate an evolved willingness to employ nuclear weapons in the course of conflict.
As Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Strategic Command, Perot spent the last 2 years gauging Russia's nuclear intentions.
I think that they feel that fundamentally the West is sociologically weaker. And if they were to use a nuclear weapon in the course of a conflict between, say, NATO and Russia, they might be able to shock the Western powers into de-escalating, into freezing the conflict, calling a ceasefire.
So they have a belief that they're just tougher than us.
No, that's definitely true.
And if they have to use nuclear weapons, we can't take it.
I think that some people might think that.
Perot is not talking about the Armageddon of an all-out nuclear war, which neither side could win, but the limited use of a few nuclear weapons which could convince the U.S. to back down.
So how would they shock us into surrender?
They could strike a European target with a nuclear weapon, maybe an airfield that they thought was vital to a conflict between NATO and Russia.
We're looking at H-hour. We're looking at the moment before the conflict starts.
David Schlapak of the RAND Corporation directed a series of war games commissioned by the Pentagon, in which Russia invaded the Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia, two of the newer members of NATO, and because of their location on the Russian border, two of the most vulnerable.
When the fight starts, the Russians have about 400 to 500 tanks on the battlefield. NATO has none.
The red chips represent Russian forces, the blue and white are NATO.
The relative size of those stacks kind of says it all.
It does. It does. This is not a happy picture for NATO.
As the scenario unfolds, Russian forces in red are storming the capitals of Estonia and Latvia.
They can get there between a day and a half and 2.5 days, 36 to 60 hours.
To retake Estonia and Latvia, the U.S. and NATO would have to conduct a major buildup of military forces to drive the Russians out.
One of the things you would expect Russia to do would be to begin rattling the nuclear saber very aggressively. To say, we're here, this is our territory now, and if you come and try to take it away from us, we will escalate.
Escalate, use nuclear weapons.
Use nuclear weapons.
Russia has more than 1,000 short-range nuclear weapons, while the U.S. has less than 200 at air bases in Europe.
There's one in Germany.
The locations of American nuclear weapons are officially secret. But here's what they look like. Hans Christensen says he discovered this photo on a U.S. Air Force website showing the inside of a shelter where nuclear bombs would be loaded aboard American and NATO jet fighters.
Each vault can have up to 4 nuclear bombs. They hang right next to each other. It sinks into the ground with the weapons, levels completely with the surface.
And then just straight out of a doomsday movie, the nuclear weapon rises out of the floor?
Right.
The bomb is called the B-61, and it's being upgraded by adding a new set of tail fins that give it greater accuracy. That would allow the B-61 to destroy its target using a lower-yield nuclear weapon, which would decrease the number of civilian casualties. The air-launched cruise missile, says Major General Clark, can also be turned into a low-yield nuclear weapon.
There is a variable yield option on this weapon, so we can change that yield within the weapon.
You can dial in a yield?
That's what we call it, actually, dial a yield.
Does that make a nuclear weapon easier to use?
We do not plan to go there. We do not want to go there.
But if you have this option, which allows you to keep civilian casualties to a minimum, and you're really up against it, isn't it easier?
I don't think that any decision to ever use a nuclear weapon should be categorized as easy.
Less difficult.
Less difficult, we could say that.
Russia is also developing low-yield weapons, which this declassified CIA document says could lower the threshold for first use of nuclear weapons. The development of low-yield warheads that could be used on high-precision weapon systems would be consistent with Russia's increasing reliance on nuclear weapons. But increasing reliance on nuclear weapons, says Rear Admiral Perraud, doesn't mean Russia is eager to use them.
I don't perceive that they have become madmen with their fingers on the button, but I do believe that they are more interested in considering how nuclear weapons could be used in conflict to either close a gap or to sustain the opportunity for victory.
So what's the scenario? What situation would get them to seriously consider the use of nuclear weapons?
That is probably the greatest question I'm trying to answer today for Admiral Haney.
That's Admiral Cecil Haney, head of the U.S. Strategic Command, the man who would carry out a presidential order to launch a nuclear weapon.
Thank you. Appreciate the update.
Low-key and cerebral, Haney commands not only this country's nuclear forces, but its cyber weapons and space satellites as well.
Is it riskier today?
Well, I think today we're at a time and place that I don't think we've been to before.
It is Haney's job to convince Vladimir Putin that resorting to nuclear weapons would be the worst mistake he could possibly make.
When you look at what would work to deter Russia, do you have to get inside Putin's head?
You have to have a deep, deep, deep understanding of any adversary you want to deter, including Mr. Putin.
So how would you describe him psychologically?
Well, one, I would say I'm not a psychologist, but I would just say he is clearly a individual that is an opportunist.
Does it concern you that an opportunist has a nuclear arsenal?
It concerns me that Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. It concerns me that Russia has behaved badly on the international stage. And it concerns me that we have leadership in Russia at various levels that would flagrantly talk about the use of a nuclear weapon in this 21st century.
The last time many of us thought about our nation's big land-based nuclear missiles was probably during the Cold War. But today, there are nearly 450 of these giant Minuteman IIIs, as they're called, tucked away in underground silos, ready to launch on the president's command. They're part of a so-called nuclear triad that includes submarines and bombers. But it's the land-based leg of the triad that's been getting all the attention lately, and it's not the kind of attention the top brass wants. The entire Air Force chain of command of a missile base responsible for 1/3 of our land-based missiles was removed a few weeks ago because of a scandal involving drugs and cheating on tests. We wanted to know what was going on. Why so much turmoil in the Missile Corps? Who's minding the nukes? And where are these weapons of mass destruction?
150 above 80 knots. Roger.
Flying over the plains of Wyoming in an old Huey helicopter, we came upon a small fenced-in lot. It didn't look like much.
So that's it right there.
Air Force Colonel Carl Jones told us that underneath the concrete near that white pole, there's a Minuteman III missile. It's one of the deadliest and most powerful weapons on the planet.
So is that particular missile armed right now with a nuclear warhead?
It is.
The warhead on each of these land-based missiles is 20 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and could kill millions if dropped on a major city. The Air Force still keeps nearly all 450 of them on constant alert, ready to go. We thought the missiles would be hidden away on some vast tract of federal land.
My goodness, is this a farm right here?
It is.
We were surprised the missiles were close to rural communities. We saw bales of hay and herds of grazing cattle.
It's a safe weapon. I mean, it's not gonna do anything here on the ground.
If by accident or a deliberate act, one of those missiles was launched, is there a way to disarm it or bring it back?
We can only launch with direction from the President of the United States. Now, once that missile is gone, there's no way to recall it or disarm the warhead that's on the missile. You know, once they're gone, they're gone.
The missiles are spread out over a wide area surrounding 3 Air Force bases in 5 different states. A web of underground, hardened and pressurized cables connect the missiles to buildings like this, where the missiles are monitored remotely miles away in capsules 70 feet underground. The control rooms hang on shock absorbers within a protective shell of concrete and steel. The system was designed in another era, the 1960s, to survive a nuclear blast. We went down by elevator and were escorted to a door that weighs 8 tons.
Ma'am, sir, I would like to welcome you to...
We were allowed to go inside, provided we use an old Air Force camera and let security officials vet this footage. The so-called missileers who watch over and control the missiles work in teams of 2 on 24-hour shifts known as alerts. They have everything down here they need to survive. We expected to find pot-bellied veterans at the controls. Instead, we found Chaz Demarath, who's 25, just 3 years out of the Air Force Academy, and his deputy, Dana Myers, 23. This was only her 5th time on duty. When they started this 24-hour shift, they took custody of 10 nuclear weapons.
So I guess I have to ask you the inevitable question. Where is the button?
Where's the big button?
Yeah.
Ma'am, there is no button.
There's no button?
There's no button.
There are 3 switches and a key, which is kept in this strong box with 2 locks on it. Demarath has one combination, Myers has the other. It's one of many layers of safeguards built into the system.
Even though we trust each other, we don't trust each other.
We thought the work would be tedious, just waiting for something that'll probably never happen to happen. But from nearly the moment we asked the question,
Is this just boring beyond belief?
It is never boring because we have so many actions we do every day.
alarms started beeping, and the phones kept ringing.
Ma'am, I need to ask all of you to remove yourselves from the gaps at this point.
So is there anything wrong?
There's nothing wrong at this point.
We were politely asked to leave at least 8 times so they could decode messages or deal with other classified information. The officers may be young.
If you can imagine that as being your computer is.
But the equipment is ancient. This, for example, is one of the computers that would receive a launch order from the president. It uses floppy disks, the really old, big ones.
Before you got down here, you probably had never seen one of these.
I've never seen one of these until I got down in missiles.
The reason the Air Force allowed us to visit the missile fields surrounding Warren Air Force Base is because it wanted to counter all the bad press it's been getting lately at the 2 other bases that also guard our land-based missiles. Last year, 17 missileers at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota were removed from duty after performing poorly on an inspection. At Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, 3 missileers are under investigation for drug possession, and 91 have been implicated in a scandal involving cheating on routine tests.
I am flying back to...
Major General Jack Weinstein took control of all 3 nuclear bases in December with a mandate to find out what ails the missile corps and fix it. Let me ask you a question. Whether there's, I guess you'd call it an identity crisis with the mission as a whole. You have these nuclear weapons that no one believes we'll ever use. So do you find that that's an issue, that the question of what's the mission?
No, because we use these weapons every single day protecting our nation. Deterrence has a value. It has a value for our nation. It has a value for our allies.
General Weinstein commands a force of 9,600, including maintenance technicians who keep the missiles in working order, security forces that guard the weapons and provide a heavily armed escort anytime the warheads are being moved, and about 500 missileers who man 45 control centers round the clock. The vast majority, the general says, have not cheated on tests.
We're talking about 1% of the 9,600 people that work for me that did violate our core values.
But when you say 1%, it's not 1% of the missileers. It's, right? You're talking about everybody.
Right.
It's a much larger percent of the missileers.
Right. It's about 20% of the missileers.
Well, that's huge.
It is huge, and that's why we've taken accountability for those people.
General Weinstein also removed the directors of operations.
On General Weinstein's recommendation, the Air Force brass announced that the Montana-based commander would resign and that 9 other officers under him would be removed. Weinstein told us investigators found no evidence of cheating at the 2 other missile bases. But that's not what our reporting found. You know, it's interesting because we spoke to a lot of former missileers, and they just say cheating goes on everywhere. And it's been going on for quite a long time.
What we did was we look at the evidence. Whenever we saw a cell phone, whether it was a text message or an email, we investigated that.
One of the people who told us about this cheating being endemic was an instructor at this base and left last year.
Well, I will tell you that as a commander, if I have any indication that people aren't following our core values, I immediately attack the problem. And we have not seen this problem at the other 2 bases.
The former missileers told us that the Missile Corps has long been treated like the stepchild of the Air Force. Pilots get all the glory. Missileers have fewer chances for advancement.
We're going to review the monthly lesson plan, and then we're going to take a test.
It's said that the reason for the cheating is a culture of perfection, where missileers have felt they had to get 100% on the tests they take 3 times a month or face no chance of promotion. We spoke to a group of current missileers at Warren Air Force Base, including 26-year-old Daniel Sharp from Tennessee. Why did people feel they had to score 100%?
When I first came here, leadership that was in place told me that the minimum passing score for my test was a 90%. But if I was making 90s, I was a D student, and I would be treated that way.
But you actually were here under that 100% pressure yourself.
I was.
Yeah, and you felt the pressure, and that caused stress, I'm sure of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also caused a great deal of studying and a great deal of proficiency. So.
No one cheated because they had to, they didn't know the material. They cheated in order to get 100.
Is that gone?
That's gone.
So what replaces that?
Well, right now, it's pass-fail. As long as they get, above a 90, which is the standard.
Wait. Pass. It's still pass. You fail at 90?
Yeah, it's still at 90 right now.
Wow. How is that improving things?
When you take away the pressure of getting 100 on a test, you have people focus on what they need to know. I think it changes things.
It's one of a number of things the general's doing to boost morale, which by most accounts has been low for a long time, even at the top. Last year, Weinstein's predecessor, Major General Michael Carey, was relieved of command for drunken and inappropriate behavior during an official trip to Moscow. According to an inspector general's report, Carey complained that its troops had the worst morale of any airman in the Air Force. How many of you chose to be a missileer as your first choice for a military career? 2 of you. Truth be told, the vast majority don't choose this job. This group was impressive. They majored in physics, engineering, and English, and many are working on their advanced degrees. We've obviously heard a lot about the morale problems, so I wonder what the morale problems come from.
Well, it fluctuates, and there are times where it just becomes a grind because you're doing so much in a short period of time a lot of times, and you just have to adapt. and work with the schedule you're given.
So it can be more than 24 hours?
Of course, weather does impact how long we might be downstairs. If we have poor weather, especially during the winter, we do get that a lot in these northern bases. You might be down there for 48 hours at a time or possibly 72.
Anybody been down for 72? No, 48?
48, yes.
Yeah, 48, a lot of you. They told us they feel things are improving, and they also assured us there are many safeguards built into the systems of the Launch Control Centers, or LCCs, to prevent an unauthorized launch.
Launch key inserted. Inserted.
Are any of you partners?
Yes, ma'am.
You're partners.
Same.
Okay, just for the sake of this discussion, let's say both of you go bonkers, and you get the key out and you switch it on. Will it go off?
No, ma'am.
No.
It won't go off.
No.
Why not?
Because there are enable codes that we need in order to get the missile ready for launching.
Only the President of the United States could authorize the launch of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And one capsule by themselves can't do it alone.
Right.
And you would have to receive the codes to put them in? You don't have them when you go into the LCC?
No, ma'am.
No.
Okay. Well, that's reassuring. An important part of their job is monitoring the condition of the missiles. If they get a signal that something's wrong, they ask for a maintenance crew to fix it. Oh, wow. The maintenance crews train on this missile that is virtually identical to the real thing, minus the rocket fuel and warhead. The systems are so complex, the technicians work off detailed checklists.
Torque to mouth separation all the way around. 2, 2.
They're constantly shouting 2, 2,
2, 2.
because the rules require there always be 2 people keeping an eye on one another when they work on a nuclear missile.
Going 2, 2.
The idea is to ensure safety and prevent sabotage.
2, 2. 2, 2, 2.
Sometimes these Minutemen IIIs have to be removed from their silos for repairs or for random test launches, without the warhead, of course, to make sure the missiles still work. These missiles were designed and built during the Cold War, when there was always the fear of a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. But the second in command of all U.S. nuclear forces said recently that he's more concerned about an accident or human error than a Russian attack. When we come back, we'll tell you about some mishaps in the past that nearly led to accidental nuclear detonations on U.S. soil. For more than 50 years, land-based nuclear missiles and long-range bombers have played a key role in America's strategy to deter other nations from using their nuclear weapons against us. But the age of the equipment is a problem, and human error is always a concern. Small mistakes, like a dropped socket, can mean the difference between routine maintenance and a major accident. We were not aware until we started researching the story how many close calls there have been involving nuclear weapons. Fires, plane crashes, fuel explosions, even a bomb that was accidentally dropped on U.S. soil. The seriousness of many of these incidents was not disclosed at the time, but based on witness accounts and declassified government documents, we have a much better understanding today of how close we have come to a nuclear disaster.
We came close on numerous occasions during the Cold War to having our own weapons detonate accidentally on American soil.
Eric Schlosser spent 6 years investigating nuclear weapons mishaps during the Cold War. His book, Command and Control, describes a number of hair-raising incidents, like a rocket fuel explosion in 1980 in Damascus, Arkansas, that forced the evacuation of people living near a Titan II missile complex.
Someone dropped a socket in the silo, and the socket fell about 70 feet, pierced the missile, caused a fuel leak, and then there was a huge explosion.
If that exploded, how come you say there was no detonation?
They put safety mechanisms in the warheads to make sure they only detonate over the target where they're supposed to, and that's a testament to the engineering skill of the warhead designers and a good luck.
Schlosser says that's not the only time we were lucky. A few days after John Kennedy's inauguration in 1961, an Air Force B-52 like this one had mechanical problems and accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb over Goldsboro, North Carolina.
When it hit the ground, the firing signal was sent, but one safety switch prevented a full-scale detonation of a powerful hydrogen bomb in North Carolina.
I'm kind of shocked because I didn't hear the story.
Yeah.
Ever, did I? Until you revealed it? Was that made public?
There was a real effort throughout the Cold War to deny that there was any possibility that a nuclear weapon could detonate by accident.
Today's Minuteman III missiles use rocket fuel that's more stable and less likely to explode. And they've upgraded some key components, too, like the guidance systems that direct the missiles toward their target.
The nuclear weapons themselves, the warhead, the bombs, are much safer than they were 30 years ago. There's no question about that. But the infrastructure, the equipment, what carries those weapons?
The Minuteman itself goes back
to the Nixon administration.
The Nixon administration.
Look at it this way. If you got a beautiful sports car from the 1960s, it would drive really fast and it would be fun to drive.
Right.
But a modern car is going to have so many more safety mechanisms that are so much more sophisticated. And the architecture, the command and control architecture, is complicated and aging.
How would you evaluate the risk of an accident happening? Human error kind of thing.
The probability is as close to zero as you can get.
Major General Jack Weinstein's first job as a young airman was manning one of those launch control centers. Today, he's in charge of all 450 land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in the U.S. You have said that you sleep well at night.
That's a direct quote.
Some people would say you shouldn't be sleeping well at night. You should be constantly worried because you have a very complex system here, and there are a lot of things that could go wrong.
The people that designed this weapon system in the 1960s, even though we've made upgrades, are actually brilliant, and there's a lot of safety mechanisms built into the system.
But during our visit to the Underground Control Center with Colonel Carl Jones, we got a glimpse of what the Missile Corps is up against. Take this enormous outer door designed to protect the corridor leading to the capsule. They can't close it because of a broken part, so it's propped open with a crowbar and marked with a danger tag. We were told the door has been disabled like this for years.
Many things in the capsule, in the equipment building, aren't manufactured anymore. So we have to figure out a way to manufacture that piece and see if the new piece will work.
At a missile silo we visited, time and frigid weather had clearly taken their toll. The missile was being pulled from the silo for repairs because water had seeped in.
It's probably the worst case of loose nukes in U.S. military history.
Some nuclear weapons snafus have happened fairly recently. In 2007, 6 nuclear-tipped cruise missiles were loaded onto a B-52 by mistake, flown across the country, and left unguarded on the tarmac. No one noticed for 36 hours. That led then Defense Secretary Robert Gates to ask the Air Force Secretary and Chief of Staff to resign. In 2010, because of a technical glitch, a missile squadron at the base we visited in Wyoming stopped receiving electronic messages from the missiles it was charged with monitoring.
What happened was we lost status monitoring of 50 missiles.
50 missiles?
50. It was a squadron.
For an hour?
A little under an hour, but an hour.
What word would you use to describe that? Is it serious? Was it dangerous?
I don't view it as dangerous at all because of the safety of the weapon system. I would call it serious when you lose status monitoring for that period of time.
Being able to communicate with the missiles and with others on the base is essential to a missileer's job. So we were surprised to learn they were having trouble hearing what was being said on their phones.
Can you repeat that?
What about the phones?
They're awful.
Yeah, they're not so great.
What isn't great about them? Is it what, the hearing, or is it that you can't connect when you make a call?
It's both. I mean, you can't hear the other person on the other end of the line. Sometimes you can't dial out, which makes it very difficult if you're trying to do your job.
Just to be clear, the president will not be calling them on the phone with his launch orders. They have other, more secure systems for that. But still,
it is an analog system. And when you have an analog system, there are problems. We're looking at upgrading that in the next few years.
Years?
In the next few
Not
years.
months.
No, years.
And they're using really, really, really old computers. I saw a floppy disk, and not a floppy disk that size. It was gigantic.
I'll tell you, those older systems provide us some, I will say, huge safety when it comes to some cyber issues that we currently have in the world.
Now explain that.
A few years ago, we did a complete analysis of our entire network. Cyber engineers found out that the system is extremely safe and extremely secure on the way it's developed.
Meaning that you're not up on the internet, that
We're not
kind of
up on
thing?
the internet.
So did the cyber people recommend you keep it the way it is?
For right now, yes.
A terrorist attack is also a major concern. This tactical security team trains constantly to take back a missile silo from the bad guys if they ever get in. Once the team enters the compound and secures the site, they go down into the silo, fast roping and drawing their guns quicker than most of us can tie a shoelace. The land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, that we saw are just one part of the nuclear triad that includes missiles on submarines and bombers. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that operating and upgrading all three legs of the triad is going to cost at least $355 billion over the next 10 years. Do we need all three legs of the triad?
I think that the one leg of the triad that may be the least useful are our missiles.
The land-based?
The land-based missiles are targets. The Russians know exactly where they are. It puts the states where they're based at risk, whereas with submarines, they're hidden. One of the things about a bomber is if the bomber takes off with nuclear weapons and you change your mind, you can have the bomber come back to the base, and you can't do that with a land-based missile.
The land-based leg of the triad. Do we need to have that?
I think it's extremely important to have an on-alert, 24/7 nuclear capability to protect our nation. I think we need to look at the problem set sometimes in the eyes of other nations. When other nations are upgrading their ICBM force, they're modernizing their ICBM force, I think it's extremely important that we provide the American public with that day-to-day deterrent value that the ICBM provides.
And that's the mission.
And that's the mission.
Hands on keys and switches.
We were watching missileers practicing their procedures in a simulator.
Mark.
Would you like to key turn?
Yes. When one of the instructors offered us a chance to do a practice launch. It was simple enough to turn the switches.
Turn.
Hold it. Hold it. Okay, release.
See?
How many missiles did I actually launch? 1 or 10?
You launched 50.
I launched 50.
50.
I would say everybody here would remember their first alert. You ride your elevator down, you go through those first two massive blast doors, and you're looking at the same console you've been training on for so long, but this one is tethered directly to 10 nuclear weapons with status monitoring for an additional 40. And that weighs on you, absolutely weighs on you.
We left the base more aware of the pressures these young officers are under and hoping their superiors will get around to fixing those phones and broken doors. Recently, the Air Force announced it would spend $19 million this year to upgrade the launch control centers and silos, and it's asking for over $600 million next year to make further improvements.
We can no longer ignore the worst-case scenario, a terrorist nuclear attack on an American city. Osama bin Laden has made it clear he wants to obtain nuclear weapons and use them against us. The 9/11 Commission considers such an attack the #1 threat today, not because it's the most likely disaster scenario, but because it would be the most devastating. The chairman of the 9/11 Commission even says he expects to see such an attack on an American city in his lifetime. Hundreds of thousands of people could die in a nuclear attack, but hundreds of thousands of others could be saved. That's because the Pentagon, after decades of searching, believes it has found a drug to treat radiation exposure. Why isn't that drug available? That's our story tonight. What would happen if terrorists managed to detonate a nuclear device in a major U.S. city? Hundreds of thousands of people would suffer from acute radiation exposure. They would be at long-term risk of developing cancer, but most deaths in the immediate aftermath would be from damage to the bone marrow, infections, and internal bleeding. Pentagon scientists discovered a possible treatment for radiation sickness after testing a drug made by Hollis Eden, a small biotech company in San Diego.
Okay.
Bob Marcella is the company's vice president.
In the summer of 2001, the military came and visited us, and they said, you know, we've been testing your drug, and we've been looking for a drug like this for 40 years.
So the military was interested in this drug for troops?
Yes. 2 weeks after 9/11, they came and visited us again and said, we'd like to develop this now, and not only for our troops, but for civilians.
Hollis Eden's drug, Numune, was not FDA approved, but the Pentagon had been testing it on mice, dogs, and monkeys, where it stopped the lethal bleeding and infections caused by radiation exposure. The Pentagon decided the drug was in a class by itself and stated in a letter to us, Numune seems to be the most efficacious, least toxic, and most comprehensive in its effects.
And then we started to look at the impact a nuclear bomb would have on a city and how many people would be exposed and potentially use this product. And we started to look at the numbers. They were staggering. They were in the millions of doses. So we thought to ourselves, this could potentially be a very big market. No, that's good.
Marcella and his boss, Richard Hollis, knew it was a market with only one initial buyer, the U.S. government. They had to convince potential investors that Washington would spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy their drug.
We started circulating in Washington, and there was a lot of support for a medical countermeasure that can save human lives in the event there's a nuclear 9/11.
The government told you many times that they were interested in your drug.
Yes, but we couldn't get it funded. So we were here in Washington trying to figure out how we were going to get it done. And coincidentally, we were here for the State of the Union when the President addressed it.
I ask you tonight to add to our future security with a major research and production effort to guard our people against bioterrorism called Project BioShield.
Project BioShield provided nearly $6 billion to create a biodefense industry. The program gave drug companies a powerful incentive to come up with new drugs to be used in the event of terrorist attacks. For the first time, there would be a guaranteed market for drugs if they tested successfully. It was the assurance Hollis Eden had been waiting for. So you have a partner in the Pentagon.
Yes.
You've got a drug that you think is ahead of everyone else's drug. You've got a bill, BioShield, that says we will invite you to participate and provide money for you. So that looks like everything's coming up roses for you.
That's what the investors saw.
With the prospect of a huge market, investors put money in the company, and Hollis Eden stocks soared from $5 to $35 a share.
The investors looked at our data and knew we had a very encouraging drug. Nobody argued the science. It was very effective in non-human primates. So you put 2 and 2 together, you invest in a company, the government's going to buy your drug, the investor's going to make money, we're going to deliver a drug to the American people that are going to protect them, and we're going to be better off.
Over the next 3 years, Hollis Eden spent more than $100 million with the expectation that the government would buy millions of doses. Finally, last September, the Department of Health and Human Services surprised everyone by announcing that it would commit to purchase a radiation drug from whichever company had the best product, but only 100,000 doses. No one expected the order to be that small.
Our stock plummeted. We went to $5 a share, and we were shocked and surprised because we just couldn't see how they could come to that decision.
No one knows where a terrorist strike might take place, but there are dozens of U.S. cities with populations large enough to be plausible targets. Drugs would need to be stockpiled in every city, according to Lee Hamilton, vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission.
100,000 doses is not nearly enough. If you really had a major attack, you probably would need much more than that. One estimate we made was that we need 10 million doses.
Who made the decision to buy 100,000 doses instead of 10 million? It was Stuart Simonson, the man who oversees Project BioShield. Simonson is a Republican political appointee who, before running Project BioShield, was a lawyer for Amtrak. Republicans, as well as Democrats, have criticized his management of the program.
Secretary Simonson just appears to be over his head on this particular issue.
Congressman Tom Davis, a Virginia Republican, chairs the committee that oversees Project BioShield. Davis, who usually supports the administration, is taking the unusual step of calling in this broadcast for Simonson's removal from BioShield. He says Simonson lacks the necessary technical and scientific background and compares him to Michael Brown, the former FEMA director who resigned after Hurricane Katrina.
Well, I think that we're seeing the same kind of issues. Michael Brown had been before our committee prior to Katrina and exhibited some of the same kind of arrogance, a lack of expertise. This is a serious job at this point, and I think we need to have professionals filling it, not political appointees.
You don't think he's up to the job?
To date, he has been singularly unimpressive in this particular area.
If it was your decision, would you fire him?
I'd transfer him out of this. I wouldn't have him handling this program.
Assistant Secretary Simonson has been under fire for committing nearly $1 billion to acquire a controversial new anthrax vaccine. But he has been given credit for successfully stockpiling drugs for smallpox. Simonson declined our request for an interview. His deputy, William Raub, was made available. He defended his boss.
When he worked for Amtrak, one of his major responsibilities were terrorist threats against the rail industry. He's brought a considerable background and expertise, and he's provided strong leadership.
Then why is the proposal now to look for just 100,000 doses to treat acute radiation syndrome? Why only 100,000 doses?
Well, this is the place to start. We don't see 100,000 as the end, we see 100,000 as the beginning.
So if you order 100,000 and there's a nuclear explosion, when do you get the rest of them?
Again, we take this as a step at a time. First off, we need agents that we can be sure will work.
If we were told 4 years ago, Ed, that they were only going to buy 100,000 doses, we would have never developed this drug.
But HHS says that the 100,000 doses is just a starting point.
They're supposed to create a market, not a starting point. If they were going to buy tanks for the military, would they just buy one tank, or would they buy 100 tanks? And I think the contractor would have a hard time spending all the money in research and not have a guarantee that they're going to buy more than one tank.
But they're not saying we're only going to buy 100,000 doses. They're saying this is where we're going to start.
How much more are they going to buy, Ed? Do we know that? Are they going to say they're going to buy millions more? See, they won't commit to that.
The thing that must be understood here is the urgency of the problem. We don't have an unlimited amount of time here. We know that it is possible to have a nuclear attack very soon. And we must not go about business as usual. Even though Health and Human Services hasn't committed to buy Hollis Eden's drug, the Pentagon continues to endorse it. Furthermore, the Pentagon's chief radiologist wrote us that one of the most desirable features of Numune is that it could be self-administered without physician supervision in a disaster scenario. The drug could be in a cartridge with a needle. You could inject it in your thigh. And is that what you want to do with your drug, to have it administered in something like that, where somebody could do it themselves?
Absolutely. That's the whole idea. We need something that's safe enough that we can distribute to people, even in their homes.
Assistant Secretary Simonson seems to be going in a different direction. He wrote a letter to Congress emphasizing that nuclear victims bleeding to death could be treated in hospitals. We asked Simonson's deputy about that. You think that the hospitals would be able to handle that load?
There would be hospital capacity that would be able to treat a substantial portion of that load. By no means would there be the ability to treat all of it, and therefore that's what makes it a catastrophe.
I talked to one of the top hematologists in this country this morning, and he said that he thought his facility, his hospital, would be able to handle maybe dozens of people. That's it. And I think if you're looking at radiation exposure, you're looking at more than dozens of people. You're talking hundreds of thousands in a place like New York, or,
That's correct.
or Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles.
But no one has ever claimed a perfect response here.
Relying on hospitals is far from a perfect solution, according to a letter from the Pentagon. In the event of a radiation disaster, the overwhelming majority of radiation victims will not have access to medical personnel. But Raub says people can be evacuated to hospitals in the surrounding areas. You imagine what it would be like to evacuate New York City?
Yes, I understand that, but also this is a catastrophe, and I think people would do their very best under those circumstances.
Who's going to drive the buses? If you have 450,000 people that are in a radioactively contaminated area, possibly with acute radiation syndrome, how are you possibly going to deal with that many people when, you know, you just saw in Katrina that we had a hard time getting people food and water?
My name is Richard Hollis.
Hollis Eden's executives believe BioShield has been managed so badly, they've decided to do what companies who have to deal with the government almost never do: publicly criticize the very same officials on whom their future depends.
And it is now, 4 years after 9/11, why is this drug not a top priority to be deployed to protect the American public? I've personally testified 5 times now in front of various committees, indicating the fact that if it's not implemented properly with the right leadership, that this very important piece of legislation, in my opinion, was going to fail.
These two scenarios.
Hollis Eden's executives say that if the government had done its part, their drug could have been ready for market this year. Instead, they're now struggling to keep their company going.
It's just so frustrating because you've got nothing but duck and cover and duct tape and plastic in the last 60 years. And then you try to come out with a countermeasure that the Department of Defense is supporting, and HHS tells you, well, we really don't need it. We're just going to put everybody in the hospital.
Without a government contract, their drug to treat acute radiation sickness may never see the light of day. What happens to companies like Hollis Eden if the government fails to recognize them and they don't get those incentives?
What happens is they fold up.
But it's not Hollis Eden's future that most concerns Congressman Davis. He says that HHS is playing a dangerous game.
Ultimately, you're betting that we don't have a terrorist attack and that we'll be able to catch up by that time. That's the gamble.
How far behind are we?
I think years from where we ought to be.
What I want to see is a President of the United States and a Secretary of HHS saying, this is my #1 priority. The #1 threat to the safety and security of the American people is the possibility of a nuclear attack of some kind. And it should be at the top of my priorities. That's what I want to hear.
And you don't see that today?
I do not see that.